Hello, Legionaries. I have a new set of guests, esteemed guests, who I've heard from for a very long time now. Me and Sergeant Barnes here are in the War Room, and we have invited two guests from Myth of the 20th Century, Adam.
Hey, everyone.
And Hans.
Hello.
Hello, hello. So I'm so glad you guys are on, and I'm sure that you have recently gone into the events in the Ukraine. As far as, how it's affected us. It's affected us at the gas station. It's affected us politically. And I'm sure there are a lot of spooks out there that are having a lot of knife fights in different brothels somewhere in Latin America. But point being is, there are a lot of instances where people are trying to pick out the future by referencing the past. And I think that what we're seeing now is after the civilizational collapse of the Second World War in the West, etc., that basically we're having this conflict, the civilizational degeneration, and ultimately speaking, there's a lot of parallels to the past, to Greece, etc. Now, I just wanted to pick y'all's brains, especially Hans, you're a classicist, and just your personal perspective about it right now.
My personal perspective on the Ukrainian War.
Yep, just kind of once over, and as far as the Correspondence Revolution as well.
Well, in the Ukrainian War, I think that it fits into perhaps a longer struggle that the Russian state has had to deal with for roughly over 1,000 years. And truly it goes back to control over the Dnieper and access to specific regions where they can sort of, let's say, paper over geographic features with large amounts of manpower. And this is sort of a generic take on why the Russians do what they do and why they behave the way they do. But I think it is probably the most simplistic one that kind of provides a good idea for their behavior.
No, absolutely,
so their position in Ukraine and the war itself really is just sort of a necessitated inevitability of their general foreign policy. And in the context of wider Russian history, this sort of thing is actually not that shocking. There was a time when the Russian princedoms fought quite frequently amongst each other, and they killed each other in huge droves. They took on different forms. The Russian princedoms and chiefdoms in the north looked radically different. Only a few hundred years after splitting from those of the south, maybe near Kiev and Suzdal and places like that. And it's not that shocking to see them behave, so differently now and treat each other differently. They've always treated each other differently. The idea of the national Russian state is always sort of fragmented. So this really is actually not that surprising for the disintegration of Russian foreign policy once again, for them to be sort of fighting amongst each other like this. And I think that from the Ukrainian perspective, they necessarily do not want to have to fork over resources potentially in their minds, or sovereignty or decision making to people that they don't necessarily consider of having a direct line of authority over them. And I think they also want to, there's concerns about whether or not the larger share of the wealth in some kind of arrangement would be theirs. And I think this is perhaps why the Ukrainians have, traditionally rejected, or many Ukrainians have rejected Russian leadership. And even within the confines of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainians were often sort of acting out and always trying to seize power and trying to shift the Soviet Union towards a pro-Ukrainian mindset, almost a pro-Ukrainian economic model. So
Yeah.
the two have been sort of on this collision course for a while. It's not really that shocking that they're fighting it out finally, and ultimately, a lot of it really is just about control of resources. I think that the Russians are looking at the iron ore deposits. They're looking at the natural gas fields. They're looking at the soil soil fertility, and they're looking at geography. They're looking at the Dnieper River as being a vital access point for trade. They're looking at those old Soviet rail networks they spent all that time building out and how they can link into the rest of Europe. And if they could seize those and move the Ukrainians out of the way, they could have a much more rapid deployment of resources into the European market, and they could corner the commodities market in Europe. And the Ukrainians are fighting for the inverse of all that. They see the resources that in their country, and they want to capitalize on it. But I don't think it should shock anyone that they're fighting it out. And this is really actually the norm of the wider Russian sphere, is that occasionally, the various princedoms do fight each other, and they can become quite bloody over what can appear sort of meaningless, but actually, this is a large part of their identity. Almost is this sort of fragmentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure you're well aware of I think it was Simeon Kolchak, the general, Ukrainian general during the white and red civil war there. So it's not really new. I've heard two different aspects about this. I mean, obviously, we're talking about the economic and realpolitik reasons as far as the contestation of that territory. However, there's two other elements here that I kind of wanted to talk about. Was specifically, the Ukrainian, let's say there's two contending schools. One is that the Ukrainian ethnicity exists and that it is separate from the Eastern Slavic, Great Russian cultural ethne. And then it's the other that says that, well, Ukrainians kind of all kind of contrived, and that the only other genuine ethnic group is the Galician ethnic group, which are technically the Ruthenians, right? But then if you go beyond that, I think really what it's coming down to is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Russia reasserting itself after having recovered from the 1990s, is this competition between the United States and obviously the reformed Russian Empire, let's say Putin as Tsar, right? And it seems to me that what's happening now is a replay of 1850s Crimean War, where the Russian princedoms, or in this case Putin, is trying to reassert his control to a warm water port in Black Sea and having greater influence upon Europe as a whole.
I think that's correct, and more importantly, I view a lot of this on the point of. I should start on your point of the ethnic question. I actually don't really. I don't really like to veer into that, but I'm not Ukrainian and I'm not Russian, so it's hard for me to know the ins and outs of their identities. And I've seen Ukrainians argue both ways, that they feel they are part of a wider Russian sphere or the wider Russian identity. And I've seen Ukrainians argue that that's just totally happenstance. They have nothing to do with it. And I've seen Russians argue both ways on behalf of Ukrainians, and Russians argue multiple directions about their own ethnic origins, their own ethnogenesis. Ultimately, I think that these are extremely large countries, right? And these are extremely large groups of people. There's 40 million Ukrainians, or there were in Ukraine alone. Probably around the world, it was probably close to 60, 70. I mean, there's just so many Ukrainians. there's so many Russians. I mean, depending on how you count Russians, there's probably over 200 million of them in Russia and around the world. So whether it's full blood or half Russian, whatever, these are massive groups of people, and of course they're all going to have their own ideas about what they are. This is not a small specific ethnic group on one island in Indonesia, right? They can rightfully say who and what their identity is and where they came from. It's very murky.
Hmm.
I think that I've seen the Ukrainian government, for example, on this ethnic question weigh in, and it's always very comes across very heavy-handed. But it's always, it's like the Schrodinger's ethnic question. We are both Russian and not Russian at the same time.
Yeah.
And it's when it suits, this is a failing on their part because it comes across as just schizophrenic. But it's like, we are the true Russians. But by the way, Russians are, mongrelized Finno-Ugric freaks from the swamp, and we're not that at all. And so, and this is like, I think that at one point the Ukrainian government actually used the term Finno-Ugric to refer to Russians, and it was just unreal. I've never seen that kind of, them so desperate to say things like that, and nobody cares. I mean, nobody has any idea what any of that means. Nobody cares. And at the same time, there are Russians that would proudly say, yes, I'm the fourth Udmurt, and I have, and we're only half Slavic, but this makes us greater. And my great grandfather was Mingrelian from the Caucasus, these obscure ethnic identities, but I'm still Russian at my core. Or you have Russians who will say, I'm from, Nizhny Novgorod, and I'm a true Slav, and and Ukrainians are half Polish dogs, and it's just once you realize how complicated these questions are, because these are again such huge groups of people over such a widespread area. Mm-hmm. Of course, they're all going to have different views of their own ethnic identity.
Of course.
Some Ukrainians are definitely just part Polish. That's just a fact. And there are some Russians that are just, part Finno-Ugrian, and it's just a fact. And ultimately, I don't think it matters too much in terms of the competition going on right now. I would say the ethnic discrepancy between them is like background noise. It's really about the resource control.
I would say, not being an expert, but just my read and listening to other people who are from that part of the world, I think the nationality aspect, setting aside the ethnic aspect, is actually prominent right now. It is. It's big. I
think it's big because you're right on the national aspect. It is big. Because they've made it a big deal. Now there's these insults being hurled back and forth at the government level, and it's bordering on like internet HBD racism. It's I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah, I'm just trying to look forward, and this thing has been going on for 10 years plus, arguably longer. But the actual physical violent conflict has been going on for about 10 years. And whatever good blood may have existed between the ethnos of the different peoples in the different parts of this region, I think it's being overridden by the bad blood of the killing that's been going on. And whatever Putin wanted to achieve in taking the predominantly Russian leaning areas of the East, he may get some of that, but he's definitely not going to get the allegiance of the rest of Ukraine, and he may not even get anything in the East. And when it comes to the economics of it, personally, I don't think this was... if you're just looking at it from a sort of a cost-benefit analysis, I don't think Russia's benefited from this. I think they're going to suffer. Maybe they thought they wouldn't have such high a cost to this, and maybe they thought they could get something out of taking these pieces of land. But Russia's a huge country, and if you're talking about natural resources, I don't think they're really short on that. Maybe they need better ports, but they had Crimea, and so I don't really know what they're gaining from this, honestly, other than a pride thing. And I think that's really what it was about. From my observation.
I doubt personally. I doubt that it's a pride thing, or that it doesn't even seem like it never really occurred that the Russian government really cared about the Donbass people that much. I think that their original take was like, well, why don't you just move? Why don't you just move into Russia? We'll give you expedited citizenship, and this will be done. But I think that then it occurred to them, well, you might not want to do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, some of the most critical Soviet infrastructure is in that region. And it was, it'd be like if we gave up, huge, I don't know, petroleum refining plants in the United States just because they were built in the 60s. We still need those, or giving up nuclear plants, or giving up grain silo. There's there have
been some nuclear power plants that have been under.
Well, hold on, let me finish here. Finish.
I was just hoping you could go through what. Well, maybe we should let Lance do a show.
So
too.
in the east, it's iron ore processing facilities, steel mills, natural gas plants, railroads. Those are the primary,
by the way,
which have been blown up. So a lot of this is.
So what do they get from that?
Exactly. So the raw materials are still there. Your point was, they already have so many commodities. Why are they interested? And I think that part of it has to do with the more easily exploitable nature of the materials there. So, for example, a lot of the natural gas deposits throughout Russia are difficult to access. It requires an extremely complex supply chain system. Something Russians have never been particularly great at is managing their supply chain. So,
you don't say.
And going.
I wonder why that is.
Going to these areas to get these resources is costly. It's difficult. They always needed foreign companies to come help them kind of finish the job. Whereas the gas fields and the iron ore deposits in the east of Ukraine are right there. They're a nice flat territory outside of the mud season. They're easily accessible. They're not that far underground. So it's suddenly, this is why the Soviets were already exploiting those resources before the fall. And just because, again, my point was that you have to view the infrastructure the Russians put in place during the Soviet era as something they still need in sort of a continuation sense. Just because, it'd be like, well, the government was different in 1960s America, so we ought to just not care about those refining plants. But we still need those. We haven't built any more, and we still need those desperately. I think that in the East, to kind of finish my point, that infrastructure is still there. Some of it's been blown up, but it's still there. It's still needed. They don't want to give it up. And I think this whole conflict was never really about, the ethnic pride or national pride or anything. When they looked at it, it basically just came down to this is critical infrastructure. And if, the Ukrainian government being independent was already an issue, now we're looking at kind of a potentially hostile one. This was infrastructure that we thought we were going to have access to. If we don't have access to it,
absolutely,
this is a major blow. And I think that was when the calculation for how to take the Donbass started. But it was never about the ethnic stuff. The ethnic stuff has come later as both countries' populations have been radicalized by attacking each other in the media.
I think what the case is here, and why I kind of bring up the Peloponnesian War, just for the audience, I don't want to insult your guys' intelligence, but for some of us who don't spend time reading all these books and stuff, it's basically the background of the Peloponnesian War in the Hellenic world at the time is the fact that every polis was formed from tribes, which had an ethnic affinity and had some genetic differences or, cultural differences, etc. And the initial conflict to the fraying point came over the island of Corcyra. And ultimately, ethnically speaking, it's the Delian League, which is headed by Athens, and then it's the Peloponnesian League, headed by Sparta. And obviously, these are two hegemonic powers. One's on the rise in the case of Athens, and the other one is the supreme hegemon. Now, I see the parallel here where Ukraine is obviously part of a larger Slavic world, especially the Eastern Slavic world, but the government in Russia is using it as a raison d'etre to basically interdict the hegemonic power of the United States, which is obviously using its soft power to flip the government into its control, right? Just like they tried to do in Georgia in 2008. And then basically the same thing happened back during the Dalian League and the conflicts, etc., where the Corsirans were going from an alliance with the Corinthians and then veering towards a revolution, which would have put the, democratic faction in place and put them into the satellite sphere of Athens. And obviously, this has upset the Spartans a lot because of their hegemonic power was threatened. And I suppose the reason why I bring this up and the Ukraine and all the conflicts that are going on. I mean, even today, for instance, I don't know if you guys heard the news, but there are Brazilian protesters that have actually stormed the equivalent of the Capitol building in Brasilia right now. And so a lot of this tension that's happening, I think in politics, when it comes to the natural world, you can't say that you can write off coincidences as coincidences. But when it comes to politics, nothing really is a coincidence. Everything is very interlinked, especially in the case of geopolitics. And I kind of wanted to talk about necessarily, as far as Americans who are observing this happening, our government is obviously occupied by some other element. And so what can we possibly see after the Ukrainian conflict, which I assume would be after the conflict of Corcyra, for instance? What is the next move, do you guys think? Do you think there will be a lot of internal displacement and internal conflict within the United States and the Western world, which is within the American sphere in Venezuela, etc.? I kind of want to pick your brains about that.
I don't see much going on. I mean, in the Western world, things have never been more unified than ever. I mean,
Well, since the Cold War, I think.
You definitely. This is really the rallying point, and
I think it benefits the powers that be in the West.
Oh yeah, and I haven't seen North America and Western Europe cooperating this effectively in a long time.
No.
And I think that for the people who had thought, the Russian, within a couple of months there was this idea going around when the war started. Just you wait until the weather gets bad, or you run out of commodities, and the Europeans are going to be trying to break away, and this whole thing is going to collapse. And I always thought that was extremely unlikely, and that really there wouldn't really be any more dissent in the Western world. I think that Western governments have cracked the code for the most part on how to keep the population suppressed. They have lots of tools that they're capable of using now, that they can sort of stave off large-scale economic crises. They can always acquire commodities from the third world. Might be more expensive to get it, but it can be done. And the Russians can be boxed out. And I think that sort of is happening. You're seeing a real bifurcation that in some ways is actually going far beyond what the Cold War saw. During the Cold War, the economic relationship between the Soviet Union and Western Europe was interesting in that, despite potentially being mortal enemies, they actually had quite a deal of cooperation with each other. And I think the Soviets saw themselves, particularly the Soviet leadership, just saw themselves as part of the wider European sphere. Weren't particularly interested in some kind of death match with France and Britain. And I think likewise, most of the leadership in Western Europe was not particularly interested in that either. Whereas now the thinking has changed entirely. And there's discussions of, potentially the French, for example, having no relationship with not only the Russians, but potentially Kazakhstan for nuclear fuel anymore. The French are basically looking at a neo-colonizing parts of Africa for the sole purpose of acquiring commodities that they need, whether it's nuclear fuel, whether it's iron ore, whatever it is, if they want it, they're going to go get it elsewhere. The German government, for example, was actually in Namibia recently, trying to secure some kind of strange hydrogen contract.
Yeah, the Germans are the most desperate in this whole thing.
It looked fairly stupid on paper, but it shows you that they have decided that the economic relationship is going to be severed, and they're going everywhere they can, shopping for resources effectively. I think that, and to your point about Brazil, I think that this is probably a large reason why Bolsonaro was gotten away with and was basically run out of the country. I think he was spotted at a Publix in Florida shopping for I don't know, like Gatorade or something recently, and he looked ridiculous. But he was probably dispatched specifically because there's a need for a stooge like Lula to be in power in a place like Brazil, so that
commodities
access to those resources is done is accomplished very easily. Keep in mind, Lula is a convicted criminal who was in jail until recently, for being a screw up and a degenerate kind of goblin figure in Brazil.
And he was a communist there. He was a communist terrorist. Yeah,
he's a real specimen, and they put him back in there because he's a guy really with nothing to lose, and you can push him around, and just to guarantee him freedom will allow you to run roughshod over that country. Absolutely. So that I think that the Western world has probably never been more united, and I suspect that much of the ongoing chaos in Latin America right now is probably attributed to the strategic vision of basically never going back to the Russians for anything that isn't absolutely necessary.
It's interesting that you mention about Africa specifically, because of the Belt and Road Initiative and the String of Pearls from the PRC expanding into those same areas. I wanted you guys' perspective as far as the State Department pushing Russia and China, who historically actually have been more at odds than with us, together in an alliance. What do you guys see in that?
Well, can I address the last question? So regarding what does it all mean for the West and the East with this new Ukrainian operation, etc. A couple things about Brazil I thought were interesting lately. I didn't know that Bolsonaro was hanging out in Miami or wherever he was, but that doesn't really surprise me. Florida is, like it was for the Cubans, a big safe haven for a lot of Latin America, in particular Brazil, because it's the largest population in South America, and so a lot of capital.
There's a massive Venezuelan population in Florida now, and it's all like upper middle class rich people from Venezuela.
And Florida gives tax advantages to foreigners for owning real estate. I forget exactly what it is, but it's incentivized, and that props up the real estate market there. I don't know if DeSantis is involved in that directly. I'm sure he's aware of it, but this has been a long-going strategy of Florida well before DeSantis. It really has nothing to do with him. But the other thing I noticed about Brazil lately was that their stock market actually has performed, unlike many others around the world, much better. I think the only other exception is perhaps the China stock market, partly because they've stopped their zero COVID policy and opened up their version of hyper lockdowns and let some of the economy function again. And their stock market has done well, but also Brazil's has, which is interesting to see. And I don't like to put my personal investments in places like this that I don't have a firm grasp on, but my just general impression of just glancing at it was, there's something going on down there. I don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense, really. I don't have any control over it, but it's interesting, and I think it correlates those movements with, I think, what you guys are describing to further support that. We touched a little bit upon, France. I'd just like to emphasize that I think France is going to be fine because of, I think, their energy grid situation. They've, I think, wisely put most of that onto a very secure and stable and reliable source of energy in the form of nuclear energy. They've got about 80% of that coming from these power plants. And I think with the shutdowns of the supply chain coming from Russia, which predominantly was a natural gas pipeline to Europe as the lifeblood of the energy and chemicals infrastructure in the manufacturing and heating aspects of the European society, I think France is looking pretty smart, as opposed to Germany, which has had to turn on their planned shutdowns of their coal plants and then turn that around and turn them back on, resume their ridiculous strip mining of parts of Germany. I think we talked about it in our show, Hans. You said that the Black Forest is being exhumed because they don't have nuclear power anymore. They shut it all down just about. I think they might have halted one or two reactors.
There's like 300 or so villages throughout Germany right now that have effectively been pulverized to make way for expansion of coal lignite processing, lignite coal processing. Yeah, there was actually there was a very striking visual that someone posted the other day, and it was members of the German police in riot gear protecting one of these coal processing plants from sort of green protesters, let's say, despite the fact that the German Greens are one of the leading parties in the Bundestag right now and have virtual control over the economy. I mean, Hauerbach or whatever that guy's name is the German economic minister, and he's a member of the Green Party. So here, you have the Green Party of Germany basically endorsing the expansion of coal mining and the destruction of rural Germany to keep the desperate German industrial sector online as much as possible.
In the short term, they don't have a choice. Fortunately, this winter has actually turned out to be somewhat mild, and the Europeans are really lucky because of that. But what they were worried about prior to the winter was that they would have potentially a bad one. Very cold temperatures, and they would have to rely upon various sources of fossil fuel, because obviously you can't heat your home with a solar panel that's covered in snow and there's no sun to begin with. And so the Energiewende, which is what the long-running German policy of transitioning away from fossil fuels towards renewables, not including nuclear, which I think is unwise, has really shut down a lot of their base load of the electrical grid. And their heating was traditionally supplied by the Russians from natural gas, as well as their industrial base with natural gas. None of that is available. I think they might be still getting some from Nord Stream 2. The pipeline that was blown up, I believe, was Nord Stream 1. And they're getting some still. I believe some of it might be still flowing through some of the other corridors. But they've severely lost a lot of that supply from Russia. And they did a crash construction project to build LNG terminals in the north of Germany to receive natural gas from the United States and places like Qatar.
They're building floating terminals right now, and I think that the strategy is to turn Spain into the primary entry point for the North American shipping of LNG to Europe. And there's
the northwest part of Spain, because Portugal cuts off a big chunk.
Yeah, I mean, so there's like three regions of Spain around the northern coast, I think, that would have these terminals. There's already two in place, one or two in place, and they're building more.
And are they building pipelines to go through France?
There's a pipeline project. Some of them are going to go over underneath the ocean, so it goes from Spain directly into the ocean, then up through Italy into Germany. Some of them will go overland through France. But the wider idea is that this will then, some of it will be processed and utilized in Spain and it'll generate electricity for the wider European grid. So I think what people forget is that Europe has sort of a cooperation, grid cooperation agreement. I can't remember the name of the organization, but the Europeans actually do share electricity across their markets. And it makes it actually very easy for certain regions of Europe to purchase more electricity from other regions that aren't using it at the time. So, for example, the Brits have actually been having a tremendously difficult time not having to do load shedding on their grid. And in order to do that, they've had to purchase large amounts of electricity from France recently through its nuclear generation. And this has put France in a very difficult position, and France has continued to purchase uranium from Russia, although that apparently may stop, in order to continue to keep the lights on, so to speak, and to keep other parts of Europe online. So some parts of Europe, like Spain, will not only act as sort of the transit terminal, they will actually eventually start generating electricity, and that'll be used in the wider European market. And going back to the chaos in Latin America, both the Portuguese and Spanish ministers have been spending actually an inordinate amount of time in Latin America the last 10 years. There was a long stretch of time where Spain effectively forgot Latin America existed. It wanted nothing to do with it. Part of this was during the Franco period. They basically had no idea what was going on. They really didn't care. Spanish politics was too cumbersome to deal with foreign policy, let's say. And the Portuguese basically were obsessed with holding on to their African territories. And when they lost those, their foreign policy basically folded up. But the last 10 years has seen
got to keep that Mozambique.
Yeah, yeah. They were ready to fight tooth and nail for Mozambique. It was bizarre. But the two have spent an inordinate amount of time the last decade in Latin America. So much so that I think the Spanish Prime Minister has personally visited multiple Latin American countries, not that very recently. And there's definitely been a push for expedited visas for citizens of these countries to more easily enter Spain and Portugal proper. And I think that the wider strategy in terms of you're talking about how united the West is. I think that the West is extremely united in filling Europe up with people. And Spain and Portugal are taking the easy route, and they are deciding to fill it up with Latin Americans. So increasingly there's reports of Spaniards of seeing large numbers of what I think originally were like Argentines, Chileans, Colombians, and now Peruvians, Bolivians, Uruguayans, making their way into Spain and settling there. And the Portuguese have noted huge amounts of Brazilians have moved in. So the West is definitely uniting around North America providing the energy, and Europe processing it. And in order to do that, I think that they're going to need large numbers of people, and Spain and Portugal will be sort of utilized as the primary hub for the North American energy transition for Europe. So and they'll be colonized to make that more easily done.
Of course. And I think that the energy situation in the West isn't as dire as we portray it to be, especially because America has a lot of untapped resources that we can tap into. The only reason why we offshore our oil to Saudi Arabia and OPEC is just because of how cheap it is to extract. However, what I think my time in the military and talking to higher ups, the main concern is the pipeline of industry. Basically, we off-put all of our industry, including what people don't understand is including ammunition and chip data and basically chip manufacturing to Taiwan, to the PRC, etc. And now what we're seeing is with the unity or increased unity between China and Russia, that our industrial base, our globalized industrial base is basically compromised, right? So effectively, Taiwan being under threat of invasion is actually strategic interest because of the fact that they're the microchip processing, center manufacturing of the world right now. And if that were to be taken, there are a lot of like economic ramifications, but military ramifications for the United States government. Now, what I'm kind of most concerned about is necessarily the lack of industry in the West and the primacy of the service industry instead, or service, in general, like white collared stuff that doesn't have manufacturing. And we can see this now in the Ukrainian conflict, where the complete disparity in military, munitions and all kinds of hardware are lacking on the NATO-aligned Ukraine because of the fact that Russia and China are still two large industrial bases of manufacturing, and pitting them together still seems to be a trump card, having industry on your side as opposed to just finance, etc. What are you guys' opinions about that?
Well, to your first point, the part of the reason why we've always sourced from OPEC, specifically the Gulf Arabs, hasn't just been that it's cheaper to extract; it's much cheaper to refine that oil. They have that's the sweet crude, is it's kind of colloquially known. The refinement cost for that crude is so tremendously cheap, and it's interesting because some of the worst crude in the world to refine, you almost have to do it at cost, is actually Venezuelan oil. And the irony is that OPEC was originally a Venezuelan led organization in order to sort of game the market on global oil reserves, because they faced a very troubling issue in that nobody wanted to refine their oil. So the one of the difficulties of the cost of taking oil is actually the cost of refining it. It can be extraordinarily expensive depending on where you get it from. The Russian Urals mix, the Gulf Arabs have some of the best easily refined crude on the planet, and that's why they're dominant. And it probably is a brilliant strategic decision in the United States to drain the whole planet of oil before using our own reserves. I've always suspected that was the intentionality behind using offshore sources or using other countries' sources, was to drain the whole planet. It never made sense why exactly the United States went from a large energy sort of extractor and refiner and exporter to this long period where we basically did none of that. And part of it was there was a need to catch up technologically, so we had to wait for the Shell Revolution, and there were some other engineering challenges we had to face because we spent so much of like the early 20th century, late 19th century getting the easily extractable crude out from places like Pennsylvania. But I think that now the strategy has just been, let's just suck the whole planet dry and we'll be the last people left in the room. I think the United States has 200 years worth of coal or something ridiculous. There's much more up in Canada. There's plenty down in Mexico, too. Governments that are easily coerced or moved out of the way. I think to your other question, which was, on the industry of the United States basically falling apart. Yeah, it's we've talked about it numerous times on our show. It's truly just tragic. Probably a major strategic miscalculation. Unlike the energy war, I think that the United States made a lot of good decisions on energy for the long term and a lot of bad decisions on manufacturing. And a lot of that was driven by the finance guys. It was driven for a lot of underlying reasons, but it was mostly led from a banking perspective. It was this wider idea starting in the 80s. Look, we just don't want to deal with this labor thing anymore. We are seeing, the writing was on the wall for a lot of communist states in the 80s. They were just so destitute and limp-wristed, and the only thing that really concerned people was their nuclear arsenal. But other than that, they weren't really that intimidating anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think it became very clear. In fact, to some extent, they were already engaging in this behavior. They were already starting to make products for the Western world. There was already a level of interplay between Warsaw Pact states and West Germany, for example, where those states were making products at the behest of the Germans. And the Germans were investing in those countries. um, to do that. Now, after the wall fell and those communist governments were deposed, then the Germans really went in. They invested heavily in Poland and in Romania and Hungary and in the Czech Republic, but they were already doing that. They already had their feelers in, let's say, and there was already, you can go back to Nixon, ironically, in the 70s, and he was touring Southeast Asia. He was on the record as remarking he thought that Southeast Asia would be the industrial center of the world one day. So there was already a belief that this could be done, and that these places were naturally suited for that kind of work. It was just a matter of the transition period. And
you think Kissinger had a lot to do with that?
I think he probably might have had something to do with it. It was a very wide effort. If you look at the history of deindustrialization in America, it was first done explicitly by large financial institutions, and it wasn't necessarily that they went to companies that they had investment in and said, tear down your factory pronto, fire all your workers, and do something else, go to China. It was more investing in companies that wanted to go to China. Many of the companies that actually wanted to invest in were new companies. For example, TSMC, the first iteration of TSMC, was started by a guy who was actually employed by Texas Instruments as a guest engineer or something from Taiwan. In Taiwan in the early 80s late 70s was a joke. It was basically it was a little hermit island that was sort of an anachronism. Nobody really understood what to do with it. Chinese were too disorganized to go take it back, and the United States had much more pressing priorities in other parts of the world, namely the Soviet Union. But suddenly, there was this idea, well, why don't we just invest in places like that? Let's invest in Taiwan. Let's invest in these new companies. And part of it had to do with the fact that in the 80s, bond yields flipped they inverted for the first time, and so large financial institutions in the United States were looking for return on investment, very easy return on investment. And they went to East Asia. They went to Latin America. They went wherever they could, where they could find somebody that was willing to do something, any new company that was around. And they sort of laid the groundwork. The 90s death blow to industry, that was more intentional. That was when the U.S. government sort of put their foot on the lever in the direction of deindustrialization with NAFTA and a series of other agreements and laws. So there was a whole slew, for example, of product safety laws, labor laws, environmental regulations, some of which are totally fine. But when they all come in rapid concert, you basically overwhelm, lots of those, let's say 50 employee factory companies that are led in some, Muskogee, Illinois, these places that make tools or they make knives or they make kitchen furniture, this kind of thing. It's just too much. It's overwhelming. So the choices are either conglomerate with a larger manufacturer, get bought out by a giant holding company. Berkshire Hathaway was doing this for a while. Or, save your honor, save your dignity, keep some of the people employed in terms of the design work, the engineering work, and ship the majority of your assets overseas. And the idea was, well, look, there's already Americans overseas who are invested there. They understand these countries. It just so happens our bank has a relationship over there. Why don't we just go ahead and do this? And I think NAFTA was really it's not sort of, and Adam I think can back me up. It really is not a cliche to say that was the death blow. It was just too overwhelming. It basically finished off a large number of small scale manufacturing, small scale production in the United States.
Artisan work, basically.
Yeah, and it and it shifted a lot of it down south to Mexico. But additionally, when much of that shifted down south, you experienced a wider problem in that many people who suddenly had various kinds of experience in the industrial sector, had different skill sets, were suddenly left without a job, and the wider sectors sort of fell apart. There was a general, in order to have an industrial sector, you have to have an ecosystem. You have to have 10 people across different parts of the country that can do the galvanizing process for steel. Their whole thing is you just send them steel parts and they galvanize them for you. They go through all the steps. That's just what they do. Mm-hmm. You have someone who, basically specializes in making specific rivets, and they have a good relationship with, the steel mills up in Pennsylvania, and they have a, very kind of nuanced contractual relationship. If you start plucking out little pieces of that, and then you pluck out lots of pieces, that doesn't automatically mean you'll then have what's remaining will conglomerate and you'll fix your sector and it'll be smaller, but it'll still be functional. It was just totally dysfunctional. And then everybody gave up. In the late 90s, everyone said, okay, it's over. The industrial sector is dead in the water. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to do these jobs anymore because the few remaining ones that were still around were not terribly interesting. They didn't, the wages weren't great. They were terrible conditions. They hadn't been invested in 20 years. And they just said, okay, we're just going to pack these up and ship them overseas to East Asia or wherever.
Absolutely.
And that was it. And
it's funny that you mentioned that, because there's actually this conversation happening with munitions manufacturing picking back up, and the Bradley fighting vehicle, for instance, a lot of them were made in the 80s and 90s, right, domestically. And a year into the conflict, and I think it's no secret that the United States is heavily involved in Ukraine right now, that we still haven't spurred up. And this exact paradigm that you've said, where downscaling doesn't necessarily mean a consolidation. It doesn't mean that systems are becoming more efficient. Effectively, what we're seeing right now is the difficulty in scaling up industry in time of war. And I think that's my point. I guess the wider geopolitical ramification of the economic situation is that I think the State Department is making a major blunder in Ukraine, having pushed its presence and pushed two manufacturing centers of the world, for instance, China and Russia, together when they're enemies, which we've kept a good. Kissinger, for all his faults, was a genius when it comes to keeping your enemies divided, right? And I think that what we're seeing now, yes, the West is united, but we have united principally the regions which are deindustrialized, that don't have the same manufacturing base that we used to have, and then we're putting together the rest of the country or the world that has that kind of manufacturing power and is proximate to strategic locations such as Taiwan, which make our microchips. Which is insane to me that 80% of American microchips come from Taiwan. I don't know if you guys have checked that out, but I kind of wanted Adam's perspective on this microchip situation. How familiar are you with it?
Yeah, I'm fairly familiar, and I have a few things I'd like to add on the previous points that you and Hans were raising as well on the general trends of industry, and I think Hans covered it on the oil aspect. I'll just agree that I think it was wise, actually, not to burn through all of the North American oil deposits all at once. You might as well use other people's oil before you have to use yours, because it is a strategic asset. Going on to let me cover the microchip thing, and then if we have time, I'll give my thoughts on the industry thing. Mm-hmm. The fact is, you're right. The Taiwanese TSMC manufacturing company in particular does produce a huge amount of what we'd call our electronics chip supply chain, component supply chain. There's a good reason for that. They have a tremendous talent at doing what they do, and the economies of scale of consolidating all of that manufacturing under one roof basically makes it such that one company, honestly, is better off just doing that type of stuff than a whole bunch of different companies having small operations. Mainly because the cost of the fabrication equipment has gone up, I'm not sure exponentially, but it's gone up tremendously from where it used to be back in the 70s when Silicon Valley, got its name, when Intel was still making everything in Santa Clara and AMD was down the road and they were making their chips to compete with Intel.
People used to do this stuff by hand, by the way. Like you can find footage from the 80s where it's I mean the chip the semi foundries were so simplistic in the early days. I mean, there was some cutting edge stuff with Intel that was all done by precision machinery, but
Intel
early
stands
stuff was very
for
crude.
Integrated electronics. That's what Intel stands for. That's why they came up with that. And what it is the integrated circuit is consolidating a lot of that hand soldering on circuit boards into a smaller surface area that is enclosed in what they call packaging that is basically a black box. And that's why you can't fix your car anymore because everything is hooked up to these stupid computers. But before, like what Hans is describing, they would literally lay out the circuit boards and solder these connections. They put the diodes in, they put the transistors in, and you'd have a basic logic circuit that could calculate 4 + 4 or something. But it's much more elaborate now, and in order to make that stuff at a microscopic scale, at a nanoscopic scale is really what it is. It's 3 nanometers. It's insane. Nobody can see this without an electron microscope, literally. But in order to do that, you have to buy this insanely sophisticated equipment. And there's basically one company, like ASML from the Netherlands, that has the best stuff on this. And there is a supply chain of other equipment from Applied Materials and Tokyo Electron and stuff like that goes into this capital expenditure. But small companies cannot afford to buy all this stuff because they don't have the throughput to justify the investment. So it makes sense to go fabless, and that's basically been the trend for Qualcomm, probably for a lot of Texas Instruments, definitely for Apple, although they're shifting away from TSMC because they want to keep a lot of that stuff in-house. But that's true because of economics. Now, when you mix in the shifting landscape of geopolitics, there is a huge concern now that the Taiwanese concentration is at a tremendous amount of risk from China. And also, the Chinese production base is obviously at risk because a lot of the electronics assembly work gets done in places like Shenzhen for companies like Apple. And Apple's actually been criticized a lot lately because they've predominantly located their final assembly of the iPhones and the MacBooks in China. And they're starting to shift away from that, from pressure from places, ironically, from Wall Street, even though they kind of encouraged it to begin with, but also the State Department. And to sort of transition a little bit towards, I think, the prospects for industry in North America, I'm actually somewhat optimistic. And I'm surprised to be saying this because I really always thought that the logic of outsourcing this stuff was very short-sighted, and it's finally gotten so bad that people are starting to see it. And I think there's something to the theory that COVID had something to do with trying to push the accelerator on reshoring, although that was happening already. Because honestly, the labor cost differential between the East Asian manufacturing base and the North American manufacturing base, at least when you include the transportation costs, has really disappeared. And if you add in the fact that the Chinese continue to increase their average annual wages of their workers, it's really not going to be any competition on a labor cost basis. And also, if you put in the Trump tariffs and you put in the Biden tariffs, I mean, they've both done the same thing. They no longer have any advantage. And I think that the tariffs are obviously political in nature, but it's basically removed the advantage on just the labor cost aspects of the Chinese. The Chinese, however, are the manufacturing base of the world for a reason. it's not because it makes logistic sense to send all of your oil around India through the Straits of Malacca, around Singapore to Hong Kong and Shanghai to give them energy and oil, and then build stuff and then ship it again another 7,000 or 10,000 miles across the Pacific to Los Angeles. That's insane. Like, logistically, that was a waste of energy. But the reason they became so successful is the Chinese are very hardworking and very intelligent. And they're also very organized and unified under one political system that allows them, that happens to be, by the way, very pro-business. You can have political unification and be anti-business. I mean, there's many aspects and examples of that throughout history. But they happen to be historically a culture that likes money, that likes to make money, and it made sense from a cultural, political, and frankly just human capital point of view to put a lot of that stuff there, if you're assuming that they'll still trade with you and you can afford to buy what they're selling you. But the United States has never had, I mean, literally, we've reached the highest level of debt to GDP in history. It surpassed World War II. And World War II was an incredible, world-shattering, literally, event where millions, tens of millions of people died. Real infrastructure was built. And what have we been doing? We've been sending people home to get Biden bucks, to buy crap from China, and to support your point. I mean, I think it's ridiculous that we buy all this stuff from overseas. But to sort of to go to the other side of it, I think finally the recognition of all the things that we've been talking about for 20 years is finally caught up to Wall Street and Washington, and they're finally addressing this. And it makes me somewhat optimistic because of the lack of labor advantage China has. It actually does make some sense now. And if there's political will, there is definitely an economic way forward. To Hans's point, go ahead.
Go ahead. I actually want to interject here because it's funny that you mentioned if we have a political will, right? Like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with General Spalding's book, Stealth War. But,
I think I did read that, actually. Is it about China?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I did. I read that, yeah.
Perfect. So you're aware, like, how, like, the PRC has penetrated not just our political class. For instance, Mitch McConnell's wife is the daughter of this huge, PRC official guy who's obviously a freaking asset. But at the end of the day, like, if any one of us has gone to a modern college campus, there's massive colonies.
That is the real issue. I think the fact that they have some politician in Washington, whatever, those guys are idiots regardless. They're going to make stupid decisions. But the real problem is we have trained millions upon millions of Chinese to go back home and compete with us. That was stupid. Mm-hmm. I mean, great. It's great for the world, but at what point do Americans get to have a job? I mean, you can't. The arrogance of the post-Cold War era enabled this. It was like America can't do any wrong. We've got the high-tech boom, despite the fact that half of Silicon Valley is run by Indians and Chinese people. We're geniuses, okay? So we can do anything, and we can go into debt more than we've ever done before. America can't do any wrong. Well, it's not true. I mean, there's laws of physics and there's laws of economics. You cannot over indebt yourself. You can't destroy your human capital base forever. There's no example of any nation or civilization being able to do that, and eventually it's going to catch up. And I think the sort of foreign student thing was really short-sighted. And what it would be is basically in places like California, where a lot of these guys, the Chinese in particular, would show up, is they would pay full freight, whereas the California residents didn't have to because they were citizens and residents of California. But the colleges were like, yeah, this is great. We're going to get 4 times the amount of money per student if we let in the Chinese.
Part of the reason why, if you look at it, I noticed a lot of that when I was in university too. The colonies, as you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a hive mind. It's the board.
And it wasn't just mainland Chinese. It was there were several other East Asians and Southeast Asians there. But if you look at it from the university administrator's perspective, it actually speaks to a very interesting problem that they are looking at from a long-term perspective. So I had the opportunity to talk to a university administrator about this issue, and they told me, look, the long-term demographic trends actually do not look good for the university systems in the United States. And that in very
it's
short
called
order,
the internet. You don't need to pay those guys.
Within our not even just within our lifetimes, but probably before we're all middle-aged or old guys, I think there's a very real chance that many universities will simply close up. You're already seeing this with the collapse of the cottage college industry in lots of rural New England, the rural upper Midwest, parts of the rural South, in parts of the Pacific Northwest. Lots of these smaller colleges that really peaked in the 1970s or a little bit earlier have folded up. You don't have the more easy availability of not going to community college, but going to a simple college, liberal arts college, or some kind of specialization, or just general education, and then doing a job in your local area. That's effectively ended. Now you're seeing it really start to impact middle-tier universities. And from their perspective, in 10, 20 years, they will be effectively out of business because not enough Americans are going to those universities. And it would have been worse. It would have been worse much faster, a lot, 10, 20 years ago, if they had not accepted foreign students in the wide amount that they did. So the foreign student influx that already happened, if that hadn't been facilitated, I think a lot of universities would have already collapsed. Because there's simply not enough, because the generations of Americans are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's becoming, despite the fact that everybody was told to go to college, it was simply not going to be enough. And many universities were looking at severe financial difficulties. They were going to have to cut not only, R&D, future expansion, interesting programs, they were going to have to go back to basics, or even still potentially even just discontinue whole majors entirely. And they didn't want to do that. So the foreign student, issue actually is a wider demographic issue in the United States.
No, absolutely. It has a strategic implication too. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. And I think that the other reason why that was what the university administrator I had spoke with that told me, this is what it was really about. It was just demographics. They just simply didn't want to go to business. So this was their best strategy. And they implemented it decades ago because they could already see the writing on the wall. Additionally, it does serve a national interest, or I think that they would like to think that it serves a national interest because they are somehow amalgamating these foreign students into their worldview, let's say, into their wider network. This gives the university itself more power overseas. Theoretically, it gives the students of the universities more power overseas, more influence, connections that they can use. Certainly, this is true for the Ivy Leagues. They definitely take advantage of the fact they have so many foreign students with ties back home. This is how people who go to Stanford, for example, can access anything from factories to cheap credit, whatever it be, on the other side of the world. They met some guy in university, and they can use that connection. Theoretically, this is actually a value-enhancing method for the United States of America. And of course, it'll bring those people into our worldview. They'll see things our way. They'll help us out. They'll do what we want. More often than not, it just doesn't work out that way. More often than not, the exploitation isn't there, or it's the inverse. And I think the universities have made a massive blunder in engaging in a lot of this. Not only, had they done it at a tenth of the level they've done it, it might have been sustainable. But, we're talking about millions now that have come to the United States and reaped its rewards. And on top of that, you have so many documented cases of the theft of IP, of research materials, of research itself. Now we've really drifted into just huge negative externalities that nobody really thought was going to happen.
Well, let's take
the universities.
Go ahead.
I was just going to.
Universities have really shot themselves in the foot, I think, and it was done. A lot of this was just done because initially it was just demographics. They just did not want to go out of business, and they thought this is the only path forward is to have these kids come in and pay $80,000 a year to come here, and we can sustain the scholarship programs. We can sustain our less popular but potentially more intriguing our program, academic programs. We can sustain all kinds of operations on campus, without those foreign student influxes, I think that the United States university system would have already looked very different by now, and would certainly look just radically different in 20 years. It would be much smaller, much more concentrated, and probably much more akin to that of like South Korea, where it's extremely competitive, to the point of where people commit suicide over it, and much more ingrained, almost pervasively into the fabric of day-to-day life.
Of course. Well, gentlemen, we're coming up on almost an hour and a half here, and so let's wrap this up with a couple of different projections from your individual points of view. Adam, first, what do you think is going to happen in the next 10 years? I know Dmitry Medvedev, the Prime Minister of Russia, has said that the UK will rejoin the EU and the EU will fall, and then it will all fall under the hegemony of the Germans. Now, I think this is a little bit far-fetched and not going to happen, but what are your principal, predictions for the next decade?
I mean, that's a tall order, even if you are the Prime Minister of Russia, and I'm certainly not. But what I'll predict is that I think globalization is going to slow down. I think there will be an era of deglobalization. I've heard this from some pretty smart people in the financial and tech world to underscore the things we've been talking about, to build off of the brief discussion we had on semiconductors. There already is remanufacturing, reshoring going on in places like Arizona. TSMC is even being forced to set up there. And I think that trend will continue for reasons of economics, reasons of geopolitics. The opportunities actually are good for reshoring. And I think that will bring back some of this industry. It's going to be difficult because of the things we've talked about the old timers not being there anymore and the kids not knowing anything about how to change a tire, let alone set up a machine shop. But that information, the good thing is the information's on the internet. It's in books. You can figure it out. I mean, Elon Musk didn't know how to do any of this stuff, but he's a smart person. So somebody asked him, how'd you learn how to put rockets in space? Like, I don't know. I read books. What do you do? It's possible to reshore and reindustrialize. There just has to be a will, and there has to be the right conditions. And I think we do have some of those conditions. When it comes to like what's going on socially, politically, that's a much messier subject and much more unpleasant one for me. But I think there is a recognition in the West that the workers have been shafted, and I think there is a tacit willingness from the leadership to give some of the share back to them, because if they don't, they're going to have the yellow vest movement, they're going to have another Trump movement, and they don't want that. So they'd rather have a moron like Joe Biden handing out cookies to people to keep them quiet, and I think that will be allowed because they don't want to revolt, and we're probably going to see more of this culture war nonsense. But I think there will be some positives in the economics. I think there will be a reversal of some of this wokeism, because I think people are just tired of it and they want to feed their families and have a family maybe. I think that's more important to people long term. So I'm actually somewhat optimistic. I think Russia is in huge trouble. And I think China actually is having some problems too, because they've run out of runway economically. They don't have that labor advantage anymore. People are tired of being taken, all their jobs taken from them. I think both of those countries actually are going to not see great things in the future. And it's not to say that I have any ill will towards them. I just I happen to not live there, and I happen to want to live in an okay place. And so I'm sorry, but I'd rather have my country do a little bit better if they slow down a little bit.
I think it's objective. It's not partial. You're not partisan. I mean, obviously we're biased, but I don't think it's a partisan observation. But are you as sanguine, Hounds?
About the next 10 years?
Yes.
To some extent, I think that there's a couple of different aspects to it. We didn't get a chance to talk too much about Peloponnesian War. We'll have to come back on and do that at a later time. But like the Peloponnesian War, I was thinking about this. I suspect over the next 10 years, conflicts will become much more murky, and they'll become global, and you'll see a lot more interaction with the third world in terms of direct military conflict. And one of the facets of the Peloponnesian War is that what was effectively the third world to the Hellenic world, which was everything from Thrace to Sicily to parts of Asia Minor or Anatolia, they became intimately involved with the conflict. And you had Spartans in some cases directly fighting in these locations, and in others you had the Athenians directly fighting. So I suspect you'll see for the first time, not the first time, but you will see the gradual reintroduction of U.S. combat operations all over the world. The United States will be in Mexico, I suspect, in the next 10 years. We will be in Colombia, more than likely. You will see direct American action in parts of Africa. Probably a very, very large-scale, relatively large-scale American mercenary operation in Eastern Europe. And likewise, I suspect you'll see Russians all over the place. I think Wagner is just a precursor to that sort of foreign policy. They're going to be everywhere. And that's one of my predictions for the next 10 years. It'll be like the Peloponnesian War, in that the huge powers of the world will be engaging in much more direct, open military combat, not with each other necessarily, but in various regions where they have some kind of interest they would like to satisfy. And that will be, I think, shocking to a lot of people. It'll be like a return to the W years, but it'll be much more chaotic. And it'll be a lot worse, I suspect, and pretty difficult for people to cope with. In terms of the economic situation, most of the planet is probably going to be about the same as where it is now. It'll probably just be a lot less lackluster. The emerging market phenomena is just dead in the water. Nobody cares what is going on in the economy of Cambodia. Nobody thinks it has a future. And likewise for most of the rest of the world, that whole that frame of mind that was very popular up until recently is, I think, gone for good. And the main interest will be in the primary powers of the world will be investing in themselves pretty heavily. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the United States and sort of reinvesting in its own infrastructure and trying to rebuild an industrial sector, or it's the Russians attempting to finish a wider internal supply chain for resource extraction and try and resurrect their old machinery industry, or it's the Chinese sort of focusing on their internal property industry and trying to figure out how exactly to plan for the urbanization initiatives and the fact that China's demographics are now upside down. A lot of the big powers are going to be focusing internally while maintaining these sorts of small but very open direct combat operations around the world. And I think on top of that, there will be you probably see some very strange cultural shifts over the next 10 years. And what's going on now is probably a precursor to that as well. And I suspect it'll get a lot more difficult to navigate, and the smart people will just sort of keep their head down and ride it out and wait it out.
Absolutely. I think I'm of the same mind as you are. I think that's how it's going to play out in the future. And I think that the demographic collapse of the West is going to have significant ramifications as far as like the civilizational twilight.
Exactly. Yeah.
But
for example, you're going to see, one many facet of that has been the much talked about rise of these industrial accidents that keep happening around the United States and the Western world. And, everyone was thinking, there's something conspiratorial about this, and there very well could be. But, the reality on the ground is there's a lot of old guys who are in their 50s and 60s, and they're retiring all like right now. And they were the last ones who knew how to maintain all these plants, all these facilities, all these small farms. They were the last ones that knew how to do it. And as the demographic situation implodes, you're just going to see a lot more of that. And that's going to be the big challenge, is how do we maintain it? I think the United States is going to be very focused on this issue. How do we maintain it? How do we get back to rebuilding it? How do we build more of it? How do we, make it new again? That's going to be the primary sort of motivating idea for Americans in particular.
I think it's exciting.
And it's certainly more exciting than the Cold War, which was very undynamic. You know what I mean? I think we're in a situation where a great power circumstance where we have a lot of interface with different and varying political forces internationally. But I guess my read on the situation personally is a little bit like more sanguine on the side of the Russians and the PRC. Why? Because, for instance, I don't know if you guys remember at the beginning of this crisis, especially like with Russia invading Ukraine, we came to understand that the majority of our fertilizer actually comes from Russia, right? And that like 70%
in Europe, I think that's true. I'm not sure about the United States. The United States has a pretty good natural gas pipeline, which is where most of fertilizer comes from. But for Europe, I think that's correct.
Well, yeah. I mean, from what I read, it was specifically it was raising the global price of fertilizer, which has implications for the.
But natural gas has come down quite a bit, by the way. So these things move up and down. It's not a permanent thing.
True. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's, from a simple soldier's perspective, obviously you guys are a lot more big-brained about, economics and the manufacturing business, but I think that there's a lot more like impetus behind these powers than we give it credit for, but also it's a lot weaker than people that are more, Russophilic or Sinophilic tend to portray it as, So I think we're strapped for another 20-year proxy conflict between these two powers. And I think what we're going to see is increasingly a more independent EU from the United States. But that's my personal perspective, and I'm really happy you guys came on. I'm sure that in the future we're going to circle back and talk more about the Peloponnesian War, but I'm glad that you guys came on. Take the time out of your schedule and from High Olympus consult with us mere mortals here. I really do appreciate it. And if you had any last words, just go ahead and share them.
Thanks for having us on. I thought you conducted the show extremely well. I have a lot of optimism, given that you're a young man and I'm approaching middle age, that there's some hope. And our show has a reputation for being very pessimistic, and I've always viewed us as more realistic. I don't want to be a perma black pillar. I do agree with the things that I said during the show, and I agree with most of what you guys said as well. But just to go back to the sort of economic analogy and apply it to the military world or anything else. What is the cure? Because we've been going through this inflation now for a year plus. What is the cure for high prices in classical economics? Well, it's high prices, because what happens? People adapt. There's opportunities. If things go up in price, people start making more of it. And then what does that do? It increases the supply and decreases the price. And similarly in politics, where one country or group starts getting ahead of itself, there's going to be resistance. That happened after the Cold War. The United States was sort of going everywhere and people got tired of it. That's why people started thinking Russia and China were sort of these bastions of hope. And in many ways they were, especially for the people that live there. But the West has gone through a pretty painful restructuring, I think, over the past 10 years or more. And I think that will continue, but I think that was necessary in order for us to get on a better path. And I think it it takes a long time, unfortunately, in politics because people, frankly, are not that smart, but they're also just busy. And a lot of the things that we observe from an unbiased or maybe just a position that doesn't force us to have as much bias that's obvious to us is not obvious to people who are making decisions. But boomers are eventually going to go bye-bye, and the next generation who's been frustrated by the leadership in our countries led by these people that just won't go away will finally have a chance to do something about this stuff. And I think that's another cause for hope. That the internet generation is very different than the television generation, and I think
I'm so sorry for you. I'm sorry you had to be raised by these individuals, with lead poisoning from gasoline. I apologize.
We had some advantages, but it is what it is, and I don't want to gainsay anybody's parents. They did what they could, and they had some circumstances that they couldn't control either. So it is what it is, and I think there's some causes for hope, though.
Absolutely. And so, Hans, any last remarks?
No real major remarks. Thank you very much for having us on. I know you'll do tremendously well in your new program here, and we're definitely not as pessimistic and dour as I think our audience on our show would like us to be, or believes we are. I'm actually a very jovial guy in my real life. This is just an internet character I play, and I'm only a black pillar on TV. So definitely don't give up. And the next 10 years are going to be, as our great host here said, they're going to be very interesting, very dynamic, much different from the slow decay of the Cold War. I think that this will be the first time in a long time where they're going to turn on CNN and they're going to say, "Mom, turn on CNN."
Absolutely.
Something is going to be lit. And it is going to be a very, very interesting life ahead of us. That's for sure.
Well, absolutely. And again, I wanted to thank you just as a background to the viewers here. I've been listening to these guys even before I had hairs on my chest and before I even got into the Marine Corps or anything like that. These guys were a formative experience, and I'm really happy they've come on, and I'm hopeful. I think what the thing is that these guys give less credit than is due for who they are. I think at the end of the day, Heraclitus said, "One man is 10,000 if he is best. These men are 1 million." So give their channel a listen to. It's the myth of the 20th century. You certainly will walk away with more information, definitely more educated, and certainly prone to souls that are far older than our own. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I really appreciate you. This is General Lance. This is the War Room. Signing off.